What is a complete human? Is it a cover model? Is it a science geek? Is it a fitness expert? Or all of the above and more? Janna and Evan are crusaders that walk the earth looking at today's issues that touch our hearts and minds. The honest and hopeful outlook on the advancement of today's society. The science behind the decay of human relationships. The necessary preparations for future generations. Join us as we look deep inside ourselves and embark on a journey into becoming a complete human.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a fascinating show in store for you. And one of the things we always talk about are the complete human four pillars of health and wellness. And that's mental fortitude, physical health, spiritual abundance, and planetary connection. I think one of the things that we always kind of come back to is mental fortitude. And there's a very prolific reason for that, is that seems to be people's biggest hang up. Obviously, we've evolved from our loincloth wearing ancestors running around the rocks trying to find food to the species that we're at today. And with modern day life, there are so many complications that come in the form of kind of our mental blocks. And so I'm super excited to introduce our next guest, who I think is going to help shed some more light on a lot of the, physiological, as well as some of the other scientific elements that can kind of help us move past some of our mental issues that we suffer as individuals and as a species.
That's right. Dr. Caroline Leaf, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you both.
I know you as well.
So for those of us who don't know, who are you?
Good question. Okay, so I am a clinical neuroscientist and a communication pathologist, and I've been involved in the area of psychoneurobiology, as well as the placement of that within the environment, so the impact of environment on humans, which is basically, in simple English, is mind-brain-body connection, and understanding what the mind is, what the brain is, what the body is, what the relationship is, and how we as humans use all of this in context of living in the world, because we don't live in isolation. We live in context of other humans and things that are going on around us. And so I practiced clinically for 25 years with people with traumatic brain injuries and Alzheimer's and dementias and autism and severe traumas. And in that process, in my early days of training back in the 80s, we were trained that the brain couldn't change and that the mind and brain were separate, but that the brain was fixed. And this didn't make any sense to me. So I challenged that and started doing research saying that I'm sure the brain can change because the mind's always changing. And so I did some of the first neuroplasticity research in my field in the late 80s, early 90s. And by the mid 90s, it was accepted fact that the brain was not a fixed organ. And now fast forward 30 years from there, and we're in a place where we all understand that the brain can change and it's constantly changing. But now we've kind of gone forward and backwards at the same time. And the forwards is, yes, we understand more about neuroscience, and that what I know about the brain now compared to 38 years ago is phenomenally different. But where we've gone backwards is in terms of understanding mind. And that's a very interesting concept. And I personally in my career have pursued mind, what it is, and the mind-brain connection and the separation between mind and brain, and the separation but the inseparableness of the physical and the mind activity and systems. And so essentially I still do clinical trials. I do tremendous amount of work in applying this stuff in real life. So I don't bring people into a university lab. I have basically go into the field. So I did a lot of almost like undercover research for almost 20 years, where I went into the field and worked with people in different circumstances. And I was running my practice and I was in South Africa at that point and worked through the whole apartheid transition, post-apartheid. So working in very, very, very challenging areas where the socioeconomic situation was terrible, the racism, the chronic environmental strains. And I wanted to work with people in those environments, as well as people in privileged environments and in corporates and in education, because I want, and all across the board, purpose being is to understand humans. What is our mind? How does our mind change our brain? What kind of autonomy and agency do we have? And how do we as humans just function in the world? And what can we do about improving that concept? And that links very much into mental health. And so I've watched mental health change in a frightening way over the last 38 years, from being something that is a human experience into something that's some kind of a disease in your brain. And it's really led to a lot of problems. So my work currently is I do clinical trials still, is to take this concept even deeper and to show people hands-on how to manage their minds and not get sucked into thinking that you have a brain disease if you have an emotion. But generally that life is tough and we have adverse circumstances, aka the pandemic, and we need to learn to deal with that, and that we need to be more trauma-informed, etc. So that's a kind of Cliff Notes version, and we can unpack that in as many ways as you'd like.
And I think that there's a ton of ways that we could unpack that. The first that I think would be the best ways is you really, in that introduction, and thank you very much for that, is kind of separate out the brain and the mind. And I think for a lot of people, that's still a foreign concept, this idea that we have a brain which might be responsible for all of the physiological functions that we, our heartbeat, our breathing, our blinking. But then there's this mind that's separate. And I'd love for you to kind of touch on that and, kind of give us some insights as to what that separation really looks like clinically and in all of your research.
Absolutely. And that's a really good place to start. And it's probably one of the most controversial areas in science currently is this concept of what is the mind and what is consciousness. And it's very philosophical, it's highly debated, it's highly contested and argued around. I'll make it really simple. The difference between the mind and the brain is pretty much can be seen in our aliveness. So our ability to have this conversation today between the three of us and then all the viewers and listeners is the fact that we are alive. We have a mind that is able to process this conversation. If we were dead, we wouldn't be doing anything. We wouldn't be able to be involved in this conversation. It's so logically obvious, but that is the difference between the mind and the brain and the body. The brain and the body are these incredibly complex physiological and neurophysiological organs. The biology is complicated. We're learning more and more. It's phenomenal. But when you're dead, the body and brain disintegrate. They're not doing anything. So what's the difference between someone who's alive and dead? It's the mind. So the mind is this capacity that we have as humans to actually interact with the world around us and with people around us and with events and circumstances, process that using the brain and the body. So the mind shows up in the brain and the body. The mind needs the brain and the body in order to actually process the experience and to convert it into something that we can actually then use and talk about. So I'm talking about mind-brain research that I've done for 38 years, which means for 38 years, I've used my mind to study this stuff, and I've used my brain and body to be able to store that knowledge and process that knowledge and then talk about that and use that in my practice, in clinical trials, in talking to people, in teaching and writing books. So the application has come from there. So here is me, an alive person, and with my mind being first cause, I've experienced life. And I've converted that life into networks in my brain and my body. And we can talk about those because your mind experience is going to three places. And then I am able to, because of that, because my because of the mind-brain interaction, I can now talk about my subject. I can now talk about this information. This is just one example. So the people that everyone listening now and watching now, they are doing the same thing. The mind is enabling us to process this conversation. So the mind is this first cause that then pushes information into the brain in the form of energy. It's all energy flow and nothing weird. It's electromagnetic light. It's electromagnetics, it's gravitational field, it's photons, it's Einstein's work. It's all very established science. It's nothing weird. And it's just that that we generate these fields, and these fields enable us to process. If you're dead, you don't generate the field. You don't have an electromagnetic force moving through your brain and your body. You don't have a neurochemical response. You don't have gravitational fields around the brain and the body when a brain and a body are dead. So the mind somehow is packaged within these gravitational forces, electromagnetic fields. It's unique to each human. Like I can't take your gravitational field, you can't take mine. We can interact, and we're designed to interact, which we know is community, deep, meaningful interaction, etc. And when that for some mysterious, we don't fully understand all the science, but as these electromagnetic fields move through the brain, there's a response in the brain. It's very quick. It's incredibly fast, and that response is on an electromagnetic and chemical and genetic level, and that's where the mind starts showing up in the brain in a physical form, and then we express this through what we say and what we do, which is then kind of mind in action. And this whole process is, so that's pretty much it. So to summarize it, here's a little model of the brain and the body, And so the brain and the body is around about, I estimate from my research and the theories I've developed, it's about 10% of who we are as humans, somewhere between 1 and 10%. But the mind that drives this is somewhere between 90 to 99% of who we are. So when someone dies, they physically weigh less. It's a very little portion, but there's a physical change in the weight as mind literally moves out. Where it goes, who knows? We don't know that yet. We're not advanced enough in science, and there's the whole spiritual aspect which we can talk about, and we have all these, these definitely whatever. There's all that sort of side, but in terms of pure hardcore mind-brain, mind is our first cause. It's our ability to think and feel and choose, and that's a triad. You're always thinking. When you think, you will feel. When you think and feel, you will choose. You can't separate those. You can't think without feeling. You can't choose without thinking. You're always doing those three. So that's on a psychological level. Our mind is thinking, feeling, choosing at 400 billion actions per second and faster to convert your experiences like this conversation into the brain. So it then goes into that it grabs this through our think, feel, choose, electromagnetics, goes into the brain then converts. And as soon as the brain converts, it grows literal thought trees that look like little trees in the brain. That's why I use these analogies. And so the conversation we're having is growing into these trees in the brain. So that's neuroplasticity. It's changing the brain. The brain then controls the rest of the body and sends a message down simultaneously to all the cells of the body to store a change in the gene code because of this new information. And that's going on all the time. But when you're dead, it doesn't happen. So mind is driving this phenomenal change that we see in the brain and the body that keeps us alive and keeps us progressing. And on a psychological level, it's us growing, evolving in our knowledge, etc., etc. Does that kind of make sense? It's complicated, but it's actually quite simple too.
Yeah.
It is, and anecdotally, I kind of, as you were explaining that, I get this vision of a computer where you've got the mind is the CPU. It's processing all of the data, and then the memory is just the vehicle that stores all of that specific data. Is there any correlation in that when we kind of look at the mind as that?
It's even different to that. I would take the CPU and the computer and everything as the physical. So the CPU, everything to do, all the computer analogy can be attributed to the brain, physical brain and body. A computer has to be switched on. To do anything, the computer has to be activated, it has to be powered up, it had to be created. That's where the mind comes in. So the mind is over and above the physical. So we can't take the physical, and that's what a lot of science is doing today. A lot of these two branches of science. Two philosophical approaches, I should rather say, in science when it comes to mind-brain. The one is that the brain produces the mind, the firing of the neurons and so on produces this thing almost like a side effect. And that then they're saying that everything's pre-programmed into the brain. And then there's the other side camp that I come from, which is that the mind actually changes the brain. The mind is an external force that needs the physical. Otherwise, it's like nowhere. So it needs the physical to activate the physical. So when I do a QEEG, for example, on someone for my research, if they did, we won't see any response. But if they're alive, we're going to see a response. So the brain is a responder, the body's a responder. If you put an EKG on your heart, you're going to get a response. You're going to see a little printout of these little waves. But if the person's dead, you don't see a printout. In other words, when we use technology on the brain and body, what we're picking up is the mind moving through the brain and the body, making the brain and body work. So so making the CPU work, because it's all part of the whole system, the physical. But the mind has got these physical components because we can use things like quantum physics, classical physics, which incorporate then electromagnetics and gravitational fields and all of that. We can see that in the brain and the body. There's a lot of research around showing all the forces, electromagnetic forces, etc., in the blood and in the chemicals and etc., and the fields, electromagnetic fields around the body and that kind of stuff.
I'm super curious about TBIs or damage to the brain and how that can be seen physiologically or even energetically. What have you seen in your research according to TBIs?
Absolutely. Well, that's the area that I initially did my research, because in the 80s there was so little research on TBI because traumatic brain injury, because they believed that once the brain was damaged, that's it. So we literally were trained as clinicians to teach a person to compensate. So okay, that's the damage, that's it. How are we going to work around that? And that seemed so helpless and hopeless and kind of negative. And So what I saw initially, when back in the 80s, we had CT scans. So that was literally it. And we had EEG was EEGs. We didn't have QEEG, but we had EEG had already begun. Obviously, it's over 100 years old. But it wasn't, and it's very, very efficient way of looking at the brain, but it wasn't used as much as it could have been used in the 80s. So essentially what I had to work on was CT scans and changes in density, etc., that kind of thing. And then in looking at the change, the biggest thing was to look at the change in the person. Because at the end of the day, we've become, in this day and age, 30, 40 years later, in this 2021, we have become very, very neuro-reductionistic. In other words, everything's got to be seen physically to think that the physical proof is the highest level of evidence that we're living in, which is not true. It's only part of, because the highest level of evidence is, how are you functioning? What's your story? How are you coping? Are you sleeping? Are your relationships okay? Are you managing the ups and downs of life? What's your narrative? And what have you gone through? What are the traumas you've experienced? And what are the traumas that you are experiencing? Because we are all experiencing trauma. Every adverse circumstance, whether it's a horrible text to a pandemic, are all levels of trauma. So what we need to focus on is a person's behavioral change. So that's what I looked at back in the 80s. And since then, obviously, with as technology has advanced, now we use QEG and you can see the response. But initially, I saw a change. I looked at the social, emotional, cognitive, and intellectual changes, as well as the CT scans in the brain. So we saw structural changes, but CT scans are very, 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 very basic. They don't really show much. It's the fMRI technology and QEEG show so much more. So with advanced technology, like in my most recent trials, we see changes in the patterns, the energy patterns. So when we talk about energy in the brain, we should talk about frequencies. And those are things like alpha, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, high beta, and high gamma. And they all work together like a big wave, like the waves in the sea. And what we want on average is the average, as we like now having a conversation, thinking about things deeply, what we would see is a very interesting pattern of, if you think of the waves, think of the sea, and think of when you're really far out, you've got these massive swells. That would represent your delta. And then as you come in a little closer, they're still big, but they're not as big. And that would be theta. And then you go up to the shore and you've got this build up of the water, which is then beta. And then the little crest on the top as it starts to break would be considered high beta. And then it crashes on the beach and then it breaks into little waves, and that would be considered gamma. Now, this is just a very kind of raw description, but it's an easy analogy. What we want in our brain, and here I'm holding up a model of the brain, is we want that kind of wave, all those waves, flowing across both sides of the brain in a coherent and balanced way. But it's unique. So when we say that, your wave pattern will look different to my wave pattern. So no one's wave pattern will look at, so everyone's going to have that kind of delineation, but it changes depending on what you're doing. It also changes for you as a person. So right now, you two are both listening. So if we put a QEEG, we would see this kind of wave pattern, and you're really focusing and concentrating, but it would still look different. So there is no normal brain. And Yale brought out a study about 2 years ago saying we've got to stop looking for the normal, because as soon as you say what normal is, then everything's defined as abnormal. And then you've got so many ethical issues involved there that it becomes a problem. What we know about brain science is that it's uniqueness. So there's an average, there's that wave. Think of the sea. No moment is the sea ever quite the same. So you get those big swells, but they're not identical. Every single swell, every single pattern that I've just described to the little breakers on the beach, it never is exactly the same. It's the same pattern, but the pattern changes all the time. That's what it's like with humans. So you two have your own unique patterns of that waveform when you're managing your mind. So getting upset, then managing the upsetness, getting sad, managing that, experiencing a reaction, recognizing where it's coming from and dealing with it. When we're in that mind management life kind of flow, we're going to get our unique waves flowing. When someone suffers from extreme, like let's take the TBI, then there's actual physical damage to the brain. Then we will see in a QEEG, we will see certain patterns, like there's too much, for example, high beta, or there isn't enough of a balance. There's an incoherence. There's an imbalance between different parts of the brain. And that then affects the 200 structures that help us to process information. So you see disrupted wave patterns, but they change from moment to moment. But ideally, you wanting to try and get people into that sort of managed state. With an fMRI, you can see, I don't use fMRI technology currently. I will be using it in the future for some of the research, but there you can actually see little pockets of damage where there's shearing of axons or damage to actual parts of the brain, that kind of thing. So what we then see when you start training someone to use their mind, when you actually start giving someone therapy, where you are teaching a person, okay, how to direct the mind, you actually then change the structure of the brain. So you can change how you think, which then changes the energy flowing through the brain, which then repairs the brain. So in the 80s, I didn't have the technology available yet to be able to show that level of change in the brain. Now we do, but we saw the changes in the emotional, social, cognitive, and in intellectual functioning. So we had people that were written off as vegetables, for example, by doctors because of their car accident or whatever being so traumatic, getting back to a function where they actually finished school and university, which is phenomenal, but through stimulating the mind to change the brain. If you don't use the mind to stimulate the brain keeps changing, but it doesn't change in big, nice, healthy changes. And so you want those neuroplastic changes that are happening anyway, because your brain's always changing. We know now your brain is always changing, your mind's always changing. But if it's not driven correctly, the change can be very chaotic and haphazard and very often negative. That's the paradox of neuroplasticity, that you're changing, but you could be changing in a negative direction if you're not stabilizing certain thought patterns and directing the change in a building fashion, especially when it comes to TBI. You want to build the brain. So when you build the brain, you then start healing the damage and helping the brain to reorganize and reorder itself, because your mind needs that brain to work through. So if the brain is damaged, the mind can't, the mind is going to get, you've got like a part of your mind, that's what we call the wise mind, which can't be touched. But the wise mind has to work with a messy mind that gets messed up all the time because of just being alive and being a human. It's totally normal. But what we want to do is get the two parts working together. You want your messy mind that's working through a messy brain to work with your wisdom, which is sort of inner core that we all have. And when that works together through deep intellectual directed thought, you then start allowing the different parts of the brain to start healing and reordering and reorganizing. And that's when we saw the changes in the brain. So I saw with my subjects, for example, back in the 90s, and since then confirmed with other research, we saw 35 to 75% improvements, which is phenomenal in intellectual, cognitive, social, and emotional functioning. So going from being non-functional to actually going back to university, going back to work, changing
Amazing.
careers. It still doesn't mean that you're problem-free. No one must ever think we're going to be problem-free. That's also not a good philosophy at all. What we need to do is recognize life is going to happen. Traumas are going to happen. Things are going to happen. We need to know how to manage that process. So I'm all about that, and not about trying to create this utopia, which does not exist. It's not realistic. It creates more damage to us. But yes, you can drive your mind to change your brain, to change your body, to change your genetic code, which I showed in my most recent research as well, your telomeres, your DNA. So it's a very exciting field. It's a very new field. It's a field that's pretty much considered the hard question of science. And I always think, why? Because if you've actually made that statement, it's the hard question of science. What made that? How did you make that statement? You used your mind, you used your intellect, you were thinking, and you made a brilliant statement. But it means that if you want evidence of mind, just look at what you're doing, look at what you're saying, look at how you're thinking, analyze that. That's evidence that mind is this very, very powerful first cause driving force.
Let's so thank you for that, and I kind of want to take a step back and look at the structural differences between TBI, traumatic brain injury, and maybe some of the more emotional trauma that I think we as a species or we as a society are dealing with COVID. And I know obviously traumatic brain injury is a brain injury unto itself, but how do you scientifically look at the inherent differences between structural damage and emotional damage from maybe something like a global pandemic?
Okay, brilliant question. And I want to thank you for asking that very insightful and excellent question, because what we had back in the 80s and 90s is we had a separation between neurological damage to the brain from traumatic brain injury, birth trauma, car accidents, medications, things that can happen, people having seizures, all that kind of thing. So you had your neurological issues, and then you had the traumas of life, which we experience through our mind into our brain, which also damage the brain and also create changes in the brain. Because if you think of it this way, your brain is everything goes through your brain. So if you're having an adverse traumatic experience, that is not going to be a very healthy, energetic wave. That electromagnetic force is going to be very damaging. So someone screams at you, that's not a nice wave. That is a traumatic wave. Someone physically hurts you, that is not the physical action. It has also got the physics component of the different waves of energy that then go through the brain and the body. So any trauma, any adverse circumstance creates a damaging response inside of the brain. So in terms of, we need to always look at the fact that if you have something like a neurological disorder from a tumor, a traumatic brain injury, medication damage, etc., that's physically changed, a stroke, a heart attack. I mean, it's physically changed structural components inside the brain, which means that mind will be affected because your mind is using your brain. So therefore, you're going to have to work on the emotional side. So with my patients with TBI, for example, we worked on helping to heal the structural damage through brain building, but we also had to deal with the emotional component because it's traumatizing to have a trauma to happen to your brain and not being able to remember and not being able to function like you used to. But you remember that, okay, I was 12th grade and now I can't even do second grade work. There's a lot of emotional trauma that comes with it. When it comes to something like experiencing the adverse circumstances of life, which everyone goes through, so take the global pandemic, it is an experience that we have processed through our mind into our brain, and it's also created damage. So here is a nice analogy. At the moment, as I've already said, we're having a conversation, and these are words, auditory sound waves, electromagnetic light waves that are coming out of my mouth, out of your mouth, and the visual, etc., or the props, etc., that is being captured by the mind energetically and processed by the mind in psychologically through thinking, feeling, and choosing. It's going into the brain, and the brain is responding electrochemically, genetically, neurochemically, etc. And there's a product that's created. So mind-brain interaction creates a product. The product is a thought, and a thought looks like a tree. And these are built on the neurons in the brain. So these little branches that you're seeing are called dendrites that would be built out of proteins in response to what's coming in. So they don't just grow, they grow in response. So you're always experiencing, from the moment you open your eyes till the moment you go to sleep, you're experiencing conversations, events, circumstances, people, etc. And all of that's being processed in the way that I've saying, physics through the physics component and then through the psychological component into the brain. As soon as it hits the brain, there's this reaction, this electromagnetic, neurochemical, genetic reaction. And that information is captured as a quantum vibration inside proteins. And those proteins group together to grow the branches. So it happens really fast. But at the moment, through neuroplasticity, through the process I've described, people are building a thought tree into their brain of this conversation. So if we talk about mind, brain, integration, mental health, whatever you've titled this podcast as, that's the name of the thought tree. So the thought is one concept, but you can see it's made up of lots of branches and there's roots as well. So a thought is made of memories. Like a tree is made of roots and branches and a tree trunk, thoughts are made of memories, root memories and branch memories. So the words that I'm saying are being converted through this mind process into the brain in the root section. So this is the source. The source of this conversation goes in the root part. Your interpretation, which is different for everyone listening, is in the branches. So as you get stuff, you interpret based on your experience and who you are and how you uniquely perceive the world. So this is totally different for everyone. This is the same because it's the same source. And this is all proteins. And the more I say, the more branches grow. So initially it started off with one branch, with this, the seed sown, in the ground. And then as you started, as I introduced myself, then some roots grew in the interpretation. And as you ask, and so on and so on. So this thing's growing as we're talking. That's neuroplasticity. And the way that you're focusing on the content is driving this process. So this is healthy. Now, let's say that we have an adverse experience like the pandemic. So here's now the same at the tree as well, but you'll see it's this toxic, wiry looking tree as opposed to a beautiful green tree. So I use this as the analogy because in the brain, we have an actual change. Instead of the proteins folding nicely and holding the vibration and growing nice little branches and having this whole balance, the opposite happens. Because the information coming in through the mind to the brain is adverse, it's toxic. So then the the vibration is toxic, the protein formation is they fold incorrectly. So instead of building a healthy version, you build a distorted version, which means in the brain there's a physical tree that is made of proteins, but it's kind of all distorted, and that's why I use this. And that in itself then creates, because this now is distorted, we know from neuroscience that the brain and the body are literally wired for survival. You can even, a lot of scientists talk about the term wired for love, which means that we don't have any structures in the brain or the body for anything toxic. So we don't have a structure for a pandemic or a rape or a toxic comment on social media. We don't have structures for that. So what happens is that we process that and we build it into this toxic form. But this threatens the natural wired for love nature of the brain. So that's why we have the immune system to protect us. So the immune system recognizes this in the same way it would recognize, for example, the actual virus of the pandemic, and it then sends out a response. This is as real as a virus, as a bacteria, which is fascinating. Most people don't realize that a thought, which is the product of your experience, your mind processing, is actually a physical protein structure in the brain. And if it's toxic, if the proteins are not wired correctly, then the immune system sends out a warning signal to try and fight this. And so it'll send out T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes and macrophages to try and consume this and to get rid of it, because this threatens your basic survival. But if you're still worrying about that issue, or you haven't dealt with that trauma, or you're still in the midst of that argument, in other words, this is plugged into a source. Think of how you plug in your computer and you get energy. These are created from a source, and if the source doesn't change, so take if the pandemic going on for 18 months, if you haven't managed that, there's this constant feed coming in, this feed that keeps keeping this going. So now your brain is trying to get rid of this, but you've got this toxic, unmanaged issue of isolation and grief and death and change of finances and all the uncertainty, and that's all in everything that's happening is in the root system, and your interpretation is always the branches, and this is now how you're showing up in what you say and what you do. And if it's not being managed, being processed, being reconceptualized, then the immune system keeps sending out signals, and then you get an autoimmune response. So we get a lot of inflammation in this area, and that starts creating brain damage. And it's not a situation of you're going to be brain dead if you have one toxic experience. It's over time, it accumulates. So not only does the immune system try and fix this, but the brain, as soon as this is built, the brain sends a message to the entire brain and body, to every single cell, to change the genetic, the epigenome. So it changes. This is stored in this every cell. Because it's distorted, it creates kind of like mini mutations. So our entire body stores this, and that's why we have body memory. This is body memory I'm talking about, and why when someone re-experiences a trauma, they feel it in their body. And this is why things like EMDR therapy and somatic therapy and yoga and all are ways of pulling that experience that's in there and in the body out, so that you can kind of reconstruct it and reorder it. And it's also the holistic experience we have when we recall a traumatic event is also coming from our mind. So our mind kind of makes sense of it all. So our body sends us signals of pain, of GI symptoms, of heart palpitations, of aches and whatever. And the brain is sending us data, because the brains are very much, if a person's alive, the brain is pulling this up, and that's data. What happened? What are the facts? And the mind kind of pulls it all together. And we then have a holistic experience where the emotions are involved as well. So the emotions are in here, but with the mind, it helps us to actually, what is that emotion? Sadness, depression, etc. So all of our mind, brain, and body will then work together holistically to help you to try to fix this, because this is a threat to your survival. So therefore, you get signals of depression, anxiety, panic attacks. And notice I've said signals. Those are emotional signals sent by the mind-brain-body connection into your conscious mind, into awareness, to say, hey, pay attention, something's going on. And also our body sends us signals, the pain in the heart, the pain in the GI system not working, tension in your shoulders, whatever they are, combinations of that unique for each person. Those are also warning signals. So that's your body working for you. And your emotions are warning signals. Also, then you can look at your behaviors. When we are very toxic and not managing our toxicity, we haven't dealt with traumas, or we're really battling in the pandemic, we then start seeing behavior changes. So it's battling to concentrate, brain fog, battling to, just sleep at night, relationship issues, communication issues. All those are big words for very specific issues in each person. And those behavior changes are also warning signals telling us something's not right. And then our perspective of life. In other words, when this is a different narrative for mental health. What I'm saying is that an experience that humans have will be built into the brain, into the body, into the mind. And if it's toxic, the whole mind, brain, body works for you, sending you signals to say, hey, please pay attention. Let's identify and deconstruct and reconstruct. And we see from neuroscience that as soon as you stand back and observe the patterns, observe the emotions, the behaviors, the physical symptoms in your body, the perspectives of how your mindset towards life, etc. As soon as you do that, you bring this protein structure into conscious awareness, and it actually physically becomes weaker. So the protein branches start shaking, become more malleable. So this is a fascinating recent find in neuroscience. It's pretty much, I think it's not even 10 years old, where we understand that the minute you're aware, the protein structure, the thought in your brain with all these memories, and there could be hundreds, there could be thousands, are weakened the minute you're aware. Now, the minute that they're weakened, this means that you can change them. And that's really important, because in terms of managing, if you don't change those will set up a cascade. So in the brain, the immune system starts the cascade. It then sends messages to the hormones. The hormone system starts changing. The HPA axis starts changing. We see increased inflammation in the brain and the body. Cortisol rises, DHEA drops, homocysteine. In other words, there's a whole lot of biomarkers that we are very established in the scientific literature, medical scientific literature, that when people are under chronic stress, if they're not, if they don't have a way of processing, they're not processing, that we're going to see these kind of changes in the brain and the body. And over time, that accumulates, and vulnerability to disease increases dramatically. So that's why we have the warning signals. So depression, anxiety, behavior changes, etc., are not diseases. There are physical changes in the brain, but and the brain and body are saying, hey, pay attention. So therefore, they are messengers as opposed to diseases. Huge difference. And how you see them will then influence how you manage them. If you see depression as a disease, then you see yourself, but you've only got extreme levels, because everyone has depression. Depression is a completely normal human response. But if it becomes extreme, where it's overwhelming, that isn't, we told in the current philosophy, that it is a disease of the brain. But it's not a disease of the brain. It's a change in the brain. But it's a response to an adverse circumstance. So there's a story behind it. So if you see the depression as one of the warning signals that your brain, mind, and body are collectively sending you, you can then stand back and observe yourself, and which is stepping into your wise mind and say, okay, I have this narrative in my life. I know that that's not who I am. And I know logically that it's because of the pandemic or whatever, or something's happened, or a combination of factors. But I can't quite pull it all together. But once you start the process of standing back and increasing your mindful awareness, you then have to go beyond that and do the deconstruction. You have to deconstruct this and reconstruct it. So in summary, you can't just go into a garden of weeds and chop off the head. You can't just say, okay, I've got a disease of depression, here's a medication, or here's a CBT technique, change that thought. It's a bad thought. You can't just change a thought. What you have to do is identify the pattern that the thought, and from the pattern you get to the thought. From the thought, you look at your interpretation down to what is the root cause. And then in doing that, you deconstruct it. You're changing because the proteins are falling apart. This thing is, energy is never lost, it's converted. So you basically deconstruct, and then you reconstruct it into something that works for you. You can't change what's happened. The pandemic's happened. Whatever happened to you during the pandemic has happened. But you can reconstruct and reorder the brain to how you want to manage it. So this is what happened. How am I going to move forward with this? And that is mind management. And that's a very, very healthy and hopeful way, versus seeing, I've got a disease of depression. I'm clinically depressed. I've got a damage in my brain. There's something wrong with me. That's terrible. On top of the fact that you've gone through the pandemic and maybe lost money and loved ones, or whatever the case may be, to be told you also have a disease. You don't have a disease. You have a response, a very, very normal extreme response to a very extreme situation. I don't know if you can hear that very, very distinct difference, but it really shifts the whole way that we manage ourselves in that process.
Absolutely. And I think one of the questions that I have is through the lens of perspective as we process this pandemic, there's the there's the kind of the emotional response as you talked about that, we've lost loved ones. We've lost money, we've lost jobs. There's emotional responses to that, but yet we are still faced with a very real physical threat to our body. So how in your work are we taking this diseased, or this, this kind of garden of weeds, shall we say, and reframing that into something that, that we can manage through this mind work, knowing that there's still a very real physical threat? Because I think that we have to separate those out a little bit and look at one that says that, yes, we still have choices to make that protect us physically, while still kind of going through this process of, working through some of the challenges or the lens that, everybody goes through when dealing with this COVID, pandemic.
So your question essentially is what are you actually asking?
Yeah, how do you separate those? I mean, really, how do you separate the emotional response from the challenges of
Okay.
COVID from the very real physical threat of a virus that could potentially kill you?
Okay, so first of all, that's an excellent question. First of all, the emotional response when you think about mind, it's your mind that enables you to ask this question. It's our mind that's perceiving the physical threat. It's our mind that's perceiving how do we manage this, the physical threat plus the anxiety and depression. In other words, your mind's doing all the work. Okay, so your mind is what we've got to use to solve this problem. So mind is think, feel, choose. That's the psychological description of mind. So in other words, feeling is the emotion. So inside the product of mind is thoughts, feelings, and choices. So think is thinking, feeling, and choosing. So the root is the actual experience, what's the uncertainty of COVID and the experiences that you've had personally and globally and how, etc. And then this is your interpretation of that, how this
Did we
is,
lose you?
how you're seeing that. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, sorry. There
Yeah,
was
it
a
just
small glitch in the.
just cut off for a second.
That happens with Zencaster. It has little glitches
I
like
guess we're
that.
back to Zoom.
Every time I do a Zencaster interview, obviously you'll edit this out. This happens. I have to tell you. That's why we stopped using it. Anyway, okay. So essentially, inside this, here's the COVID pandemic thought tree, and it's got like thousands of roots. Every experience, every newscast, everything you've read, the processing of it, then your interpretation, your personal experience, everything is inside this tree. So this tree has got thoughts, feelings, thinking, feeling, and choices. In other words, the data in here is or has also got emotions. So the emotions are tied into this. So basically, you can't separate out emotions from, you can't pull them out as a separate thing. Emotions are just one of the signals that we will experience. They're inside of here. They're part of the data. When you have an experience, there's the data plus there's the emotion attached to the data. We can never separate those out. So when we talk about depression or anxiety or uncertainty or concern or frustration or anger, those are emotions that are linked to data. So you've always got to see them together. So the data that we're talking about, therefore, is the fact that we have this COVID virus. We're still learning more about it. We have the vaccination. We have the breakthrough variants. We have all the transmissibility of people that are vaccinated. We have the whole politicized everything that's going on. Those are all the data with the emotions inside of that. So what we have to do is recognize it's all one package, and that is what we have to reconceptualize. So we have to recognize it and change it to a point where we can actually manage that process more effectively, which means that I have to turn it into something that's not that COVID is healthy, but my management of the process is healthy. So you have to work. So for me, for example, I, as a scientist, interview doctors, have friends that are in the medical profession, epidemiologists. So I'm gathering as much information as I can in my root system to understand everything I possibly can about the COVID virus, the vaccination, the options, etc. I'm also watching data to see how do we manage because all this data has all this emotional stuff attached to it, how do we take the data, which is kind of clinical, and how do we deal with the emotion that's attached to that, because they're not separated, they come together. That's the point that I'm making here, is they come together. So then how do we deal with, that's the data, this is this. And then I read studies, for example, like the both generations, the older and the younger generation, have experienced depression. Every generation has, but there's been extreme states of depression in the older generation and the 18 to 25-year-olds. So 65 plus and 18 to 25 have, this is one of the studies that has come out. So I'm using this as an example to answer your question. So the older generation, however, their depression was less severe than the 18 to 24-year-olds. So if we look at that, what does that mean? Depression is a signal. It's a messenger. So in the older generation, they were having extreme depression, but somehow they managed it better with their mind. Somehow they took this depression as a signal, and they were able to deconstruct and make sense of it and say, okay, this is the case. I am isolated, but what was their but? Their but was the context of their life. So this is a study that was done on 65-year plus. So they have got 65 years plus of life that they've lived. So they've got all these thought trees, all these memories where terrible things have happened in the past, and they got through them. So they can draw on years and years and years of contextualized experience. And also, the older you get, your memory becomes much more conceptual as opposed to very detail focused. 18 to 24-year-olds, on the other hand, are just starting out. They've just left school, they're going to university, or they've just left university, starting a job. Their whole future is ahead of them. The kind of context they have is not relevant. It's relevant, but it's not very helpful when it comes to the future, because they don't know the future. They haven't had a future, whereas the older generation have had a future. But they were able to be less isolated because they were more technologically advanced. So a younger generation had more contact with people. The older generation had less contact with people. The older generation had more contact with memory. The younger generation had less contact with memory. The older generation fared better because of the context of memory. So, and the
Could that
context
also
of the
be,
whole thought.
and not to interrupt you, but could that also be an element of futility, where you're an older, so you have this perception that I've kind of lived my life, so if COVID gets me, it gets me, whereas the younger generation is more concerned that they wouldn't necessarily experience the full breadth of life?
I don't think one can generalize like that. You obviously would find some people with that attitude, but everyone is still very much, wherever you're at your age, in general, the average person is thinking of still of the future. They're thinking of still living. Yes, it's towards the end of their life, but they still
And
have got
survival.
grandkids or survival. Yeah, it's all about, I've still got maybe 20, 30 years. Who knows? Medicine's advancing. Maybe I've got more. There's that, in general, that will be the thinking. If someone's really sick already and they're really old, even then, there's been interviews done with really old people, maybe in the 80s and 90s, and so on, that have still seen that there's still hope, because you want to look back and you want to leave something for the younger generation. You want the future to be. So there's all that kind of conceptualized context that we've got to look at as well. But the to come, and it's a good question, but to come full circle back to your question, is that if you bring the two generations together, you then have, and this is just one example of a solution, the way that we deal with this reconceptualizing the situation, because it's happened. You can't change what's happened, but you can change what's in you. So then we bring the two generations together. You've got the younger generation can help the older generation learn more technology, get more advanced technological skills, so they can deal with isolation better, because now they can WhatsApp and they can text their family and they can get on Zoom. And the older
Not
generation can say,
Zencaster,
hey,
Zoom.
listen, Zoom, not Zen. Very good. And the older generation can then share more about life and the wisdom of life, and give context and hope. Because the big thing is that the younger generation have lost a lot of hope in COVID, a lot of hope. If you don't see that future, you lose a lot of hope. And that can lead to, and lack of hope leads to things like suicide and extreme levels of depression and dissociation and those kind of things, which are still not diseases. They're still damaging the brain, but they're still not brain diseases. They are, the source is the adverse circumstance. The response is in the brain, and the mind is the thing in between processing it. So to deal with that, I say that we have to come together collectively as humanity. We have to look at our environment. We have to look at people. We have to work together. And we have to look at the different impact on the different age groups. And we have to see how we can use that to create a way of helping people to reprocess, to break down the toxic, not just live, because people are just living in the toxicity and the hopelessness, and that we have to change, because this is the new reality, and we have to grab at what we are offered. So we are offered scientific fact that those that are vaccinated definitely are managing to get, if they do get breakthrough illness from the Delta variant or whatever, they're getting through it. Look at the science. I know the science keeps changing, but that's good. Science should always be changing. I mean, I'm a scientist for 38 years. There isn't one thing that stayed the same. Things keep changing. There's underlying basic values, but the story of science is never fully written. So we mustn't be fearful if CDC changes guidelines or regulations, or if new science reveals this, or if science seems to contradict. That is the process of how we discover and move forward. We need to embrace all of it and not think it's a fight. Embrace all of it. And that is a reconceptualized way of thinking. It is of, okay, I've been in the pandemic. This is the situation. These are the things that happen. I need help financially. I need help with grief management. I need therapy to process the anxiety I'm feeling. I need, et cetera, and I also need to understand, there's different sides of the coin in terms of science. I need to have lots of discussions. I need to keep an open mind. That's what people aren't keeping, an open mind to debate fair. That's what it means to reconceptualize. I'm not saying that that's all wonderful and glorious. It's not. But the only way you're going to get through this thing is by accepting that has happened. Now, how are we going to make it work for us? What can I do to make my life better in terms of moving forward? How can I change how the past is going to play out into the future? That's reconceptualization.
Mm-hmm.
And then that deals with emotions and facts, because every fact is always associated with an emotion. You can't separate them out. You have to look at the whole picture.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that there's been this weird approach to COVID, predominantly, and I think it's almost a political response, is that we should have all of the answers. Like there's some egocentric idea that we've evolved far enough in the human existence that we should have all of the answers. And by recognizing that the science and the data changes minute by minute, gives us that freedom and flexibility to reframe all of this.
Exactly.
But I've never seen a polarization on science like I've seen in this pandemic, and it's
crazy.
from people who are not scientists.
Yes, that's
I
the
think
main.
that's
Yeah.
so
Sorry, I
I'm
didn't mean to
listening to
interrupt you.
I'm talking to everybody in social media world is like, unless you have PhD or doctor after your name, shut up. Listen to the people.
I agree with
How do
you,
you really
and
feel?
I'm
yeah.
sick of it.
No, honestly, it's quite right. But then you'll get the argument of the people that are very right wing scientists, and I mean, I've had people on my board that are neurosurgeons and that are anti-vaccine, and I think with all your knowledge and science, and they can quote papers. So in other words, there's polarization, but fortunately, the polarization, I stand corrected, but as a scientist, I see less polarization in the world of science than I see in the world of politics, and politics is we should not be, as you said, we should not think that it's not a bad thing if CDC changes guidelines. It's not a bad thing if a new study comes out and says, hey, hang on, we've got this thing, this lambda variant now is telling us this, so maybe that, or that the vaccine doesn't this or does that or does this. We've got to look at, that's good. We're getting data. The more data we have, the more we move in a direction of, but that's where we have to step back, and this kind of toxic mentality of, we've got to, as you said, there's got to be one fixed answer. If you change your answer, it's bad. There's got to be one standard message. That's ridiculous, because we keep learning new things. We're dealing with an uncertain factor here. So we have to go to a certain extent on the historical thing of like mRNA technology and what vaccines have done in the past, and how we've managed crises globally in the past and historically, and look at various patterns and look at the global patterns we're seeing now. Like, for example, the areas that aren't vaccinated, we see more death, and a lot of them, it's not through choice that they didn't get vaccinated. They just don't have access to vaccinations because of what we know, what's happening, and not getting whatever. And there's enough evidence there, if you look at a global map, to see that those people that aren't vaccinated are dying, and those that are vaccinated are surviving or getting sick and getting through the sickness in the majority of cases. So it's that kind of, we've got to open our mind to look globally and not make it a fight about you threatening my politics, or it's my rights, and when people go on about, but it's my civil right, I always say to them, are you aware that there's actually a study that's been done that says that the more times that you say I, me, myself, I, if you make everything about I, you increased your chance of cardiovascular issues by 42% in the next 12 months. It's not about I, it's about me in the world. It's about you and me in the world. And that's what we need to look at holistically. So I know we're getting into sort of philosophical, spiritual stuff here, but seriously, it's that to cope with the pandemic, we have to become more globally focused.
Well, and I think that there's an element of this that goes far back into our history is that we are a communal species.
Exactly.
And the good of the community will always trump, always
Exactly.
was kind of the driving force. And in that, this idea that we're taking away people's civil responsibility, well, the essence of who we are is based off of responsibility. And that responsibility is
Exactly.
that I'm going to take care of the tribe. So if you don't want to
Thank
get a
you.
vaccination, your choice, just stay the freaking side of your house for a
And
couple
wear a
weeks.
mask.
Yeah.
And wear a mask. The basics of that's one of the most basic scientific facts that's been said. Why do you think a surgeon wears a mask when they go into surgery? I mean, why do you think in the medical profession they wear masks? It's such an established, simple thing that we can keep from lockdowns happening. And even that is it's astounding. But that's because I think the politics have played into it, and people have got this toxic thing of you trying to take away my freedom. And and that's no one is. We're just trying to survive as a species. We're trying to survive as humanity.
And these are usually the asshats that are saying freedom isn't free. It's like, well, if you're going to say that, then back that up with the action that says, I will put myself and the future of the species that I'm a part of, above political ideology and again, science. And I think we've definitely gone off into left field here, but I want to bring that back. We're almost out of time. So I think one of the things that we've really kind of focused on here is this idea of reframing what ultimately end up being these toxic thoughts, these things, these, shall we say, not positively charged proteins in the brain. So I'd love to leave our listeners with, one or two good concrete steps on how we go from toxic tree to very green and lush tree.
Absolutely.
And I think, let's close out with that is, what are some things that people can really focus on in the wake of COVID as we're kind of uncovering all of these new variants and all of the data? How do people actually transition those, the silver tree to the green tree?
Great. So in other words, let's land the plane for people.
There we go.
Let's land the
Yes.
plane. And I think it's great. It's good that we've had the conversation we've had, because we can really take the high emotions that are, this has been an incredibly data emotionally challenging time. So we all do have these very strong trees. So anything that is very intense creates a very, very, very strong pattern in the brain, and it's physical. So to get to deal with all of this and to get this conversion process happening, right from 38 years ago, I started trying to find out how to do this with my patients that had been through traumas and war traumas and sexual traumas and TBIs and so on. And I developed a theory and a process. And as a scientist, I've constantly continued to grow and develop that concept. What I was looking for was how can we gather our thoughts to the point where we can actually change and reorder the brain and change and reorder the body in a healthy way. And the concept is called the neurocycle. And and I'm sure that we didn't even talk about that, but in my latest book, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, I have explained a lot of what we've discussed now is in the first half, and then the how-to, which I'm briefly going to explain, is in the second part. And I also have an app called the Neurocycle app. So the Neurocycle, available on iTunes and Google Play, and that really, it's like me giving you therapy. So what I've discovered from my research and working with all of this vast experience over 38 years in different extreme situations and so on, and then just day to day for myself, just being alive, how do you just manage just dealing with stuff, is the system of the neurocycle, which basically helps you to collectively gather your thoughts and drive them in the right direction. So it's kind of like taking your messy mind to control the wise mind. I mean, sorry, it's the other way around. Wise mind to control the messy mind. And that's why I talk about the concept of cleaning up the mental mess. So first of all, it's okay to have a mess. If you feel like you're a mess now emotionally from COVID, it's totally normal. It's an adverse circumstance. Every day is filled with various different adverse circumstances. Besides the pandemic, there's life. And so we need to be more trauma informed. We need to be aware that there's great stuff that happens and there's bad stuff that happens, and we're going to respond to those stories, the adverse stuff, in an emotional way, physical way, all the ways that I've been describing. And that really is okay. It's okay to be a mess. In other words, it's okay to be a little scientist exploring, because you can't control the events and circumstances. You can't control what's happening to you. You can't control people. The only thing you can control is how you're going to respond and how you're going to manage the responses that you already, maybe your reactions that were toxic. So knowing that, And knowing that you respond, you also then impact the world in a positive way. So it's to give yourself, the very first tip that I give people is to give yourself permission to be a mess. If you're sad, depressed, angry, frustrated, don't come down hard on yourself. Don't think, oh, I shouldn't be like this. Don't think that, oh gosh, I've now got a brain disease. Just throw all of that narrative out the door and say, okay, I'm a human. Life's tough. It's been particularly bad this last 18 months. And on top of everything else that maybe you've already been going through, and that's okay if you feel a mess. Give yourself permission. So important. What we see is that as soon as you give yourself permission to actually be like this, you then have 1,400 physiological responses, neurophysiological responses in your brain and your body that will now start working for you. In other words, your beautiful brain and body will now start kicking into a different kind of mode of function that makes you feel more resilient. And then then your brain is just like more open-minded, if for want of a better word, to the mind. And the mind you can start getting access. So it's giving yourself permission. Then it's being very kind to yourself. It's being very generous and saying, this is not who I am. At the core of who I am, I'm wired for love. I'm this amazing person who can do something that no one else can do. There's no need to. At our core, we are phenomenal. And I know people, and this is not motivational speak, this is science speak. Humans are phenomenal. There's something that each of you can do that no one else can do. And if we get that and recognize that, then the way that we're showing up isn't because we're broken or we damaged goods. It's because we've gone through stuff that has damaged the core, it has damaged how we're functioning. So how we show up has a reason, and there's a reason behind it. So it doesn't justify you staying there because it's causing brain damage and it's increasing your vulnerability to disease by 35 to 98%. But it's saying it's okay to be a mess. I'm like that because of get my physiology shifted, and now let's see, why am I showing this pattern? Why am I in this extreme state? And it may be that you already know the answer. It's COVID. You know the root is COVID, but you still need to break it down. What exactly about this whole pandemic has created the situation that you have this pattern of not being able to function very well and living in a state of overwhelm and burnout and whatever it is that you're living in? What's your predominant pattern? So then when you do that, you shift your whole neurophysiology into this I'm amazing, I'm showing up because of, there's a reason for this. And that gives you a sense of peace, and different hormones flow and your brain waves change, and you go from having like a tsunami in your brain where there's this like crazy crashing of waves on the beach to having that waveform I described earlier on, so that you can start thinking clearly. And then it's almost like you've got this massive forest of thoughts inside your brain, because we've been building these thoughts with all their memories from a certain age in the womb to now. And so imagine a big forest, and through the middle of the forest is this beautiful green trees that are perfect. And on the sides of the forest are these little trees and big trees that are not as green. And there's also in between, there's toxic trees. So in the forest that you're flying over at the moment of your life, there's a whole cluster of COVID toxic trees, and they're emanating all these smoke signals of depression and physical ailment in your body and overwhelm and life sucks and whatever. And look at the most predominant ones and say, okay, well, that's not who I am. Who I am at the core is that beautiful dark green forest. This is just what's happened to me and how I'm showing up. So let me land my plane at that tree through listening to the signals and start unpacking and reconceptualizing. And that's what the neurocycle does. So that's the setup's very important. What I've found from my research is that if you don't set it up like I've described, and I go into detail in the book and in the app, I'll walk you through this, is you're not going to get the same benefit. You're just going to be putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And we know that's not going to work. You're chopping the head off the weed will grow back. So we have to set this up properly. And then you can add an element before you start the hard work of, deconstructing, add the element of brain preparation, which is basically things like meditation, breathing, etc. You can do whatever you want. There's a million different ways of doing that. And I give lots of examples in the book and the app. And you spend a couple of minutes doing that. And then you start the neurocycle, which is a 5-step active mind process where you get the messy mind to work with the wise mind, where you literally stand back and observe yourself looking at this tree, and you start rebuilding this tree, breaking it down and rebuilding it into something that you can actually manage. And you do that daily. I just want to give the time frame. It's not a quick fix. Nothing's a quick fix. If you're looking for a quick fix, you're never going to find it, because there isn't one. To manage our mind's constant ongoing process, your mind never stops working. Even at night, your mind is working. So mind management is the core overarching result of neurocycling. Neurocycling is the system for how you manage your mind. And neuroscience shows we can do this every 10 seconds, which basically loosely translated means that while we're awake, we can monitor how we are thinking, feeling, choosing, responding, talking, acting. You can watch yourself. And as the more you practice this, the more you become able to, and I show in my research, 81% more efficient at self-regulating your responses and catching them. So if you get irritated, instead of staying irritated, which is brain damaging, you can catch that irritation and reconceptualize it through the 5 steps. So each step is driving certain processes in the brain. So like the first step starts, the setup that I've just described basically pulls the toxic thought into awareness and weakens proteins and starts getting a bit of coherence between the two sides of the brain. And then as you progress through step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, different things are happening inside the brain and the body. And I put that in the book. There's a whole chart, and I've done a simplified version. So you don't have to even read that, but it's just that's how it's been set up. So you can't skip a step. You can't go jump around. It's basically a lifestyle that you develop. The easiest way to then, in terms of time, to take the COVID response and to turn it into, this is not going to take one 5-step little quick process. You're going to have to work at it daily. You use the 5 steps for 15 to 45 minutes a day for 21 days, for more or less 3 weeks. Then you have basically found this, done your brain preparation, which you do every day, deconstructed it and reconstructed it into a healthy thought. It takes about 21 days. So you've kind of got to the point where you are, okay, well, this is what's happened. I need grief counseling because I've lost this one. I need financial help. I need to talk to this. I need that. This is the uncertainty. I need to vaccine, whatever that looks like, to make your life keep moving forward. But at day 21, you haven't yet got a habit. It doesn't take 21 days to form a habit. Only when you have a habit, which is actually called automatization in science, only then will there be a change in how you run your life. I hate to talk about behavior change because it's too surface. It's actually your whole functioning will only change after another 42 days. So it takes around about 63 days. And you may have to do multiple cycles of 63 days of doing the 5 steps daily before you've established a thought pattern that's strong enough that you'll actually find that you're doing this. It's not a narrative of, oh, I should be doing that, but I can't do it. And I know you know those narratives where you know what you should be doing, but you're not doing it. That will happen if you just go to 21 days. You have to go beyond to the point where you are actually living the new narrative. So this has to become strong enough, watered, to become strong enough, the new thought, big, strong, that it impacts your conscious moments so that you can actually then live that out in your life. Otherwise, it's going to be a nice to know. So that I want to stress that time. So the first 21 days is about 15 to 45 minutes. Then the second 42 days, phase 2, is about 5 minutes a day. And that does all this phenomenal science. And I've done all the science over all these years to show that. At the same time, when you train yourself in that, you can then apply the 5 steps in a quick application. I have a thing in the app called Neurocycle Guides, and I put it in the book, which is as you establish you do the long stuff for the big stuff, the big traumas, the stuff that are patterns that are established patterns. But during the course of the day, stuff happens, like you about to do an interview maybe, and someone sends you a terrible email and it completely throws you off course, and now your emotions are all over the place and your mind's all over the place because you're totally upset, but you have to gather your thoughts to get back to do the interview, because that's what you've got to do next. So you could do a quick 5 steps in a minute and go through that same cycle to get the neurochemistry and the brain lined up like it should, get that compartmentalized, go into the interview, come out of the interview, and then go back and unpack that and sort that situation out. So there's carryover into the general functioning of the day as well. So that's kind of the overarching principles in depth in the book.
Wonderful.
I love that. I actually have a quick random philosophical question. So we talk about energy, and I'd love to get your take on this. But if energy never dies, what do you think happens to us when we die?
Well, energy transfers. It never, and you
Right.
know what? With advances in science, we're probably going to learn new things. So at this stage in
Mhm.
science, we understand that energy always transfers. So I'm deeply spiritual, and so I believe that there is this. Just I believe in godness and loveness. I don't believe in one specific fixed. I don't think religion helps us at all. I think it, and that's my philosophical view.
Mhm.
I think the laws of religion can be very limiting. I think if someone can use a religion to help them, that's how they see godness. So I think godness and loveness is beyond what we see. Just there's more to just this, because there's just, I mean, just look at the sunset. Just look at if I look at the brain, I just think that this is just phenomenal. I mean, just how
Mhm.
it works. So science has shown me a very spiritual side. And I see the most deepest spiritual part of me coming out in science because it's just so enormous and it keeps on growing, which means there must be something bigger. So in terms of what happens, I believe there's definitely something after this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is, and I don't think we need to know. I think maybe one day who knows? But it's godness and loveness. The core of who we are is it's good, and it's going to be there's because everything is so phenomenal. Just the way that a rose is colored, it's so beautiful that there must be something beyond that is even more beautiful. And I think that that's the kind of hope that. So I can go in for hours about this, but that's a sort of big Cliff Notes version.
Yeah,
of
I love that. We talk about it all the time, so I wanted to get your take.
Cool.
Fantastic.
Well, I think we are unfortunately out of time. I think this is one of those conversations that could go on for hours, especially as we unpack not just COVID, but the separation of mind and
Life.
brain
Mhm.
and life and all things that are really the driving force in how we live our best existence. We will definitely put your information in the show notes. Dr. Carolyn Leaf, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Complete Human podcast.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. And thank you for some great questions. I enjoyed our philosophical debate. And if people want to know more, I'm sure you'll put in the show notes my Instagram handle, my social media handles, Dr. Caroline Leaf, and the book's available everywhere. I've got lots of books. And the app, if they want to know how to detox their brain, the book and the app are really my latest book and the app really help a lot.
I love that.
Ladies and gentlemen, if your mind is like my sock drawer and that messy, I think that there's probably some great opportunities here for you. So again, Dr. Carolyn Leaf will put all her books, her app in the show notes. This has been another edition of the Complete Human Podcast with your host,
Janna Breslin.
and Evan DeMarco. We will see you next week.
Bye, everyone.